Right, welcome back. Today we're going to talk a little bit about another market structure, and the one that we're going to focus on today is the market structure called monopoly. And, well, it's certainly the only one to have a famous game named after it. We know that. And we also know, partly from our exposure to the classic board game, and partly from our discussion earlier, that the market structure called monopoly is the situation in which we have a single seller in the marketplace. Now, that creates a number of differences between the situation that we looked at last time in perfect competition and this new kind of market structure. Most notably at the start is that when we talked about perfect competition, we drew two different pictures, you'll remember, side by side, where on the left we drew a picture of the market as a whole. That was a supply and demand diagram. And on the right, we drew a picture of an individual firm. So this time, with just a single seller, there is no difference anymore. The market and the firm are essentially one and the same. So we can draw a single picture that represents both the market and the firm. And I'm actually going to, maybe I should label this axis, the vertical axis, dollars instead of just price, because we're going to draw a number of different things on the same picture. The next thing that we notice when we talk about monopolies, because there's just a single seller, is that the monopolist faces the entire market demand curve. So here's just a normal downward sloping demand curve, and the monopolist has to pay attention to what price they set, because the price that they set is going to determine how many units they can sell. If they set a high price and we're up in this region somewhere, then they don't sell as many units as if we set a low price and we're down in this region down here. Now that's different from a perfectly competitive firm. You'll remember perfect competitors were price takers, right? Because there were many of them and there was perfect information. They were all selling the same good and all of that. They simply they observed price, they listened to the farm report, found out what the price of the good was, and then they reacted to that price. But they didn't have play any role in setting price. Monopolists, on the other hand, though, they are going to be able to be price setters to some degree. Now, that doesn't mean that they can set any old price that they want. They can't compel someone or force someone to buy their good, so they are still bound by the behavior embodied in the demand function, but within the constraints of this demand function, they can set high prices if they would like low prices or prices someplace in between. Now, what that means is that, and I should be maybe clear up front, that the situation that we're going to be talking about here, and we'll look at another version later, but the situation we're going to be looking at here is the case of a one-price monopoly or a uniform price monopoly. And the idea here in the one-price monopoly is that the firm has to charge the same price to each customer. So charge the same price to each customer. And more explicitly, and using some of the terminology we'll get to later, they are not allowed to practice price discrimination. So they have to charge the same price to each customer. This has an important implication, and the important implication is that the marginal revenue, which you'll remember is the extra revenue generated when you sell another unit, sorry, getting a text now, the marginal revenue that they earn is equal to the extra revenue generated when they sell an additional unit. What it is not equal to anymore, as it was in the perfectly competitive case, it is no longer equal to price. And in fact, it turns out that marginal revenue is strictly less than price. So the idea here is that when the monopolist decides to sell an additional unit, the way they do that is they slide down the demand curve, charging lower prices, lower and lower prices as they increase quantity. That means that the extra revenue generated, marginal revenue that they get when they sell, say, the 101st unit is not equal to the price that they charge, because they're charging, right, they're a one-price monopoly, they're charging the same price to everybody. So if they've already made those other transactions, you can think of it as giving your earlier customers a little bit of a rebate, right? You see these deals a lot of times at the retail level. If we have it for a lower price later, come back and we'll give you the difference, that kind of thing. Or maybe an easier way to think about it is that the monopolist hasn't picked their quantity yet. They're just kind of considering a range of possible quantities. And as they consider that, each of the different ones that they add adds a little bit less than price to their revenue. And in fact, it turns out that the marginal revenue curve for a monopolist is steeper, right? That's the less than price bit. And in the case of a linear demand curve, as we have here, it turns out that it's twice as steep as the demand curve. So that's important information. Now, in addition to that, so we have our demand curve and our marginal revenue curve. They go together as a pair. So if the demand curve were to shift in, then marginal revenue would shift in accordingly. Marginal revenue is derived from the demand curve itself. On top of that, I'm just going to sketch in, just for the sake of our discussion here, a marginal cost curve and an average cost curve that have all the usual properties. They cross, right? They're both kind of U-shaped. They cross at the bottom of the average cost curve and so on. And then we're going to think about the decision rule that the monopolist, the one-price monopolist faces or needs to make in order to maximize profit. And the decision rule they're going to apply is that they're going to pick a quantity where, just as it was for the perfectly competitive firm, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost for all the same reasons. So they ask themselves sort of this hypothetical question, I've sold 50 units, should I sell the 51st unit? Well, I should if the amount of revenue I generate by doing so exceeds the amount of cost that I have to pay to produce that 51st unit. So again, both of these things are marginal values. They're calculated at the value for the next one. And if we take that into account here in our picture, this is the point where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal. So we're going to set quantity at that level, and we'll put a little M on here for monopoly, set quantity at that level. And then the second question that the monopolist has to answer, the first one is, well, how much should I sell? Answered that with the marginal revenue, marginal cost condition. The second question is, what price should I charge? That's a bit easier because the answer is I should charge the highest price that I can if I'm looking to maximize my profits. Now again, that doesn't mean I can charge any price up here in the stratosphere, but at this quantity, once I've set QM star, then I go up until I run into the boundary that represents the highest price I can charge, which is the demand curve itself. And that's where I decide to set my price. So I'll call that P star M. Now, just as we did, we'll use the same color even, just as we did in the perfectly competitive case, we can think about profits by comparing the price that the monopolist is able to charge with the marginal cost, or I'm sorry, the average cost that the monopolist has to pay, and the difference between those two things right here, right? So this term is average cost evaluated at Q star M. It's an M, should be an M right there. That thing, there we go, is profit margin, just as it was in the last lesson that we had. So if we think about profit margin as that vertical distance, quantity, optimal quantity is this horizontal distance, then this rectangle, which I'm going to shade in brown here, this rectangle represents profits to the monopolist, to the monopoly firm. Now, unlike the case where the firm is engaged in some sort of competitive market, if you really are a monopoly, you really are the only seller in your market, and you're able to maintain that monopoly status, then there's no change in the long run. Right? That is, if you are earning positive profits now, there's no reason that you would need or would want to not earn those same positive profits in the future. Now, you may have to work a little bit harder to keep potential competitors from joining, but if you have a patent, for example, is one of the things that could convey monopoly power on you as a firm, as long as that patent is in force, there's no reason why there's no way that a competitor would be able to join your market, and therefore you end up earning the same level of profit over and over again. There is no long-run adjustment. Now, I'd like to spend a couple minutes talking about price discrimination as well, and the alternative to this one-price monopoly solution. So let me pause for a second, get a clean screen, and I will be right back with you. All right, so welcome back. I've again got a little bit of a jump start on you while I was switching over the screen here, and have started the conversation, started to draw a new picture for a price discriminating monopolist here on the right. Let me first of all talk with you for just a couple minutes about what price discrimination is, and it's pretty simple. It just involves charging different prices to different consumers or different groups of consumers. So it is the relaxing of that one price monopoly assumption that we were making in the previous discussion. So I'm going to charge different prices to consumers or groups of consumers. In order to do that, two things have to be true. First of all, I have to be able to identify them somehow. So maybe I think that there's a difference between the amount that men and women are willing to pay for a product, and I can identify that. I can just post different prices for men and women. Perhaps willingness to pay, or the amount that people are willing to pay for something, varies by age. So I could make the price depend on your age, right? You see this at the movies, for example, where you get to pay a lower price if you're a child than if you're an adult, that kind of thing. And once I identify those customers or groups of customers, the other thing I need to be able to do is I need to be able to prevent resale. If I'm going to charge a different price to kids than I am to adults, for example, I need to have a way to stop kids from buying cheap tickets and reselling them to adults. The age one is good because I can just check ID if someone doesn't look like they match the age on their ticket or the type of ticket that they have. So if I can do those two things, even to some degree, I can practice some kind of price discrimination. Now it turns out that there are three types of price discrimination, kind of three categories. And since we're not terribly creative lot, us economists, they have pretty simple names. They are first degree, which is often referred to as perfect price discrimination. Second degree. Anybody want to guess what the third one is? Yep. Third degree. And in the model that I'm going to show you over here on the right, I want to talk specifically about the first degree or perfect price discrimination case, because it's the easiest one to start with. So to do that, what I want you to remember, well, first of all, let me add in some information here about cost. So let's add some cost curves in here. So all we really need for now, I think, is marginal cost. So we'll do that. Now remember that the demand curve, the way that it's formulated in our definitions, it represents the amount, the number of units that individuals want to buy at various prices. That's the definition of demand. We could just as easily, though, think of it as going the other way, going from quantity to price, thinking about the most that someone would be willing to pay, say for down here for the first unit, or for the second unit, or for the third unit, and so on. So this represents willingness to pay. Now, one way to interpret this is that each of these points on the demand curve represent individuals and their willingness to pay for the good. So we have some folks here, and they're on the demand curve, and these things are the amounts. They're the amount of money that they're willing to spend on the good. Now, the way that first degree or perfect price discrimination works is that it assumes that we can identify, as a firm, we can identify these willingness to pay values completely and perfectly. So thankfully, from a consumer's perspective, this isn't entirely true, but it's not too hard to imagine a scenario where it could be true, where the firm knows exactly the amount that I'm willing to pay. And if they do, then they'll simply set a price equal to that amount, and that will give them, right, so they'll charge this person this high price, and they will earn an amount all the way down here, down to their marginal cost. They'll earn that much in profit from that person, or that much in producer surplus. Same thing for this person, they charge a nice high price and they earn that much. And for this person, they charge a high price and they earn that much. But you'll notice that each individual is paying a slightly different price. So the way that this could be implemented, I have a little bit of a sci-fi streak in me sometimes, and so I've thought about cases where I wish I could develop this thing, where someone develops a machine, I'm going to call it the willingness to pay-o-meter, that can read your willingness to pay. So they mount this machine, looks kind of like a metal detector, and it looks like this, and it's got a little screen on the top. And they mount it in the doorway of the store, and individuals, they pass through here, and when they come through the door, then up here on the screen it reads out their willingness to pay for the good. So when this person walks through the door, the willingness to pay-o-meter reads them, scans them somehow, and beep, it posts up the amount that this person that says, here's your number, you're willing to pay this much. My salespeople have an easy job. They just approach this person and say, would you like to buy a unit for this much? They say, well, yes, I do. And you sell them the good for that price. Now, One of the things that you notice with this kind of thing is that there's no reason anymore for us to stop at some low amount, right? We're going to sell every one of these units as long as the price I'm able to charge, which is the sort of reading my way down the demand curve, exceeds marginal cost. In effect, what has happened now in this case is that once again, marginal revenue is equal to price. And this is pretty important because it turns out that this result ends up looking very, very much like a competitive market, and with one important difference, but it looks a lot like a competitive market. In fact, we often think of the marginal cost curve and the supply curve as being the same. Well, maybe we'll put a little squiggly equal sign. They're not exactly the same. There's some technical difference, but they're more or less the same thing. And so this outcome, which is where we would end up as a perfectly price discriminating monopolist, is exactly the same outcome that we would get if the market were competitive. Right? So this is the optimal quantity for monopoly with perfect price discrimination. It also is the quantity that the market would produce under perfect competition. Now the big difference is that in perfect competition, buyers and sellers split this amount of surplus somehow, right? I don't know how equal it is, depends how steep the supply and demand curves are, but they split it somehow. And in the perfect price discrimination world, right, first degree price discrimination, the firm captures all of the surplus. So there's an issue of income distribution and potential inequality here that we shouldn't ignore, but at least we get to the point where we don't have any inefficiencies caused by falling short of the competitive output level. Now the other two, just quickly mention, I won't walk you through the models, the other two types of price discrimination are not quite as onerous in terms of what they require from an information perspective, and they are also not quite as productive at capturing all of the surplus for the firm. There might be something left over for firms. So second degree price discrimination is often referred to as menu pricing, and it involves a case where individuals kind of self-select or self-identify with their choices. So if you list, if you sell cereal box, you sell boxes of Cheerios, for example, in the store, part of the reason that there's 3 or 4 different size boxes is that by offering that menu of options, individuals, by the choice that they make, will tell you something about their willingness to pay. And of course, what usually happens in that circumstance is that you get a discount if you buy in bulk, if you buy the big box as opposed to the small box. And then third degree price discrimination is just discrimination by groups instead of discrimination by individuals. This is like the movie example that we mentioned earlier. So that's the story of price discrimination. I mentioned way back during the introduction to market structures, right, we had this thing with this line that we drew, right? We said, okay, perfect competition was on this end and monopoly was on this end. And I called perfect competition the most competitive market you could possibly imagine. Monopoly, the one price monopoly situation that we started with today, doesn't really quite fit the bill as the least competitive case that I can imagine. But this certainly does, right? A perfect price discriminating monopolist, someone who has tons of information, that has a willingness to pay meter, is able to extract all of the surplus. Now that is the least competitive kind of market I can possibly think of. That's all for now. We'll talk with you soon.